Hi everyone. I actually didn't come with a funny story, but with a kind of engaging story. I think all of us have probably known of people, or even have had the experience ourselves, of having an animal come into our life, sometimes for a very short period of time, but just long enough to make a major difference in our life. And that's the story of Hercules. But first I have to tell you about John, the person whose life Hercules changed completely. If any of you have lived in the country or on the edges of the country, and you know what I'm talking about rural poverty, there were certain things about rural poverty that just stand out. There's almost always an old wreck of a car on blocks in the side yard that are being mined for parts, and slowly over time the car itself is disappearing as all the parts go into the junker that is still in the driveway and still just barely running. John had a car like that. He lived in a place down on the river that was known for folks who were just a little bit higher than hobos. To call it a house was an exaggeration. This was plywood, it was tin, it was old siding. He just put together stuff with a top and he called it a house. It's not really what you would call a house, but John was very happy there. He was basically a hermit. He'd lived by himself in the woods down by the river for years. And in fact, when you walked into the house, the first thing you saw on the right, literally just beyond the front door, was the shotgun rack. There were at least 12 shotguns in the rack. He told me that, in fact, for years before suburbia started to creep in, that he would stand on his front step at night and shoot dinner. Now, I got to know John because I was working for the visiting nurses, and we got to visit all kinds of people that you would never meet in everyday life. Because he was a hermit, this is definitely someone most of us will never meet. He was able to get by on his pension. He would go every now and then to the store to stock up on supplies, but this guy was in the woods. So this one day, he's out in the backyard, and he sees this very bedraggled big dog coming through the woods. His fur is matted, he's filthy, and he's wearing this thick iron collar around his neck, and it's attached to steel chain, and the links are about that big, and the chain has been broken off. And he's a little afraid because this is the biggest dog he's ever seen. It looks like a German Shepherd. If you know, German Shepherds, generally the pedigree form, have a black muzzle. And he was a little afraid, as I said, but the dog came right up to him and was very friendly and wagging his tail, so he figured he's okay. And he read the tags, and it said Hercules, which made a lot of sense to John at that point. And he called the owner and said, "I think I've got your dog here." And the owner said, "Well, bring him over." So we piled him into his car and brought him over. The owner of the dog lived in the same circumstances, the same rusted out carcass of a car up on the blocks and the junker in the driveway. But this guy also had washing machine parts. He had all kinds of interesting old motors sitting in the yard. There was no grass, mind you. It was just all this stuff, the detritus of civilization. So the owner of the dog takes Hercules, doesn't say anything to John, not thank you or anything. He takes the dog to the backyard and ties him up to this post, which is fixed in the backyard. He takes another 6 feet of chain and ties this big dog with that 6 feet of chain to the post. And the dog was very disappointed. A few weeks later, who shows up again but Hercules? And again, John dutifully calls the owner, packs the dog in the car, takes him over to the owner. The owner takes him out back, ties him up to the post with some more steel chain. And this time the dog is looking at him and saying, "How could you do this to me?" The third time that Hercules shows up, John has finally gotten it. Thank you very much. John has finally gotten it that he's not returning the dog to this guy who's going to tie him to a pole and give him 6 feet of room to run around in. And so they lived together pretty much very happily with one or two minor little problems. One is that John only had a twin bed. Hercules weighed about 130. When he was standing on his hind legs, he was 6'3". John was only 5'8". So Hercules would always get into bed first, and that left John about 6 inches between the wall and the part of the bed that Hercules left for him. Other than that little problem at nighttime, though, things were going very well. I should tell you that John was diabetic, and for years his diet, being the kind of wild hermit that he was, and he would go down to the convenience store, he would get frozen corn dogs, French fries, cheap hamburger meat and rolls, Fritos, Slim Jims for dessert, and potato chips. Oh, also Diet Pepsi because he was diabetic. So obviously this was a diet that wasn't going to sustain a diabetic. And he ends up going into an insulin shock, and somebody finds him. It's around Christmas. They were going to bring him something to eat. They call the 911. They take him in. And the hospital sends him home right on Christmas Day. Well, one thing that's happened as a result of all this is that right now, as he's just come home, he can't walk. And they don't bother to send a wheelchair home with him. So he's stuck in bed. There's nothing to eat. Even if there was anything to eat, he couldn't get to it. But Hercules does fetch a half-eaten bag of Fritos from the table, brings it over to the bed, and the two of them share the rest of the bag. Now, John hasn't been able to move. He's got to do his business in bed. Not very lovely. So the next day, the visiting nurse comes out, and she's horrified. She's just totally horrified. The place is freezing cold. John only has this little wood-burning stove. So Susan, bless her heart, this is what you do for the visiting nurses, especially out in the country. She went out and chopped wood and brought it in and started a fire in the stove. Went out, got her groceries, brought that back, cleaned the sheets, did everything. Called me and said, "Leslie, you got to do something. I don't think this housing is going to work anymore for this guy. He can't do this kind of thing anymore." So she said, though, but make sure when you call John, you better make sure that he puts that dog out in the backyard. And I said, why? And she laughed. She wouldn't tell me. So, okay, so I go there the first time. By then, his relatives have come by and said, John, we know that there's some elderly housing out in our part of the state. They're all the way over the western part of the state. And they said, we don't think you can continue to live like this as a hermit in the woods and chop wood and everything. You can't even walk. And he agreed, but he was still very reluctant. So when I came to visit him the first time, he wasn't sure. And I told him, I was wondering about his dog, what would happen, you know, and he said, I don't know, that's why I'm not such, so eager about doing anything. So I told John that I was trained as an animal communicator, and would he mind if I talked to his dog and asked the dog what the dog thought. So he said, fine, and I did. And the dog said, well, you know, John definitely can't live here. He definitely needs to go someplace. But I'll tell you, I don't think there's a lot of elderly housing places around that are going to take in a 130-pound German Shepherd. Do you? I said, no, I don't think so either. And so he said, more's the point. You know, living in one of those little tiny apartments would be for me like being tied to that post in the backyard, and I don't want to do that. So much as I love John, I think it's time for us to part ways. And I told John that, and the dog faced John and told him that, and John looked at the dog and said, you would give me up because you care about me? And the dog said, yeah, I love you, John. I'd do whatever it takes to help you. And for the first moment in this man's adult life, he saw a creature that truly loved him and accepted him as he was, and that the dog was willing to let him go. I had found a place that could take the dog. But that moment of recognition as the dog and John looked into each other's eyes and realized they truly loved each other as well as you can love another being. And what that dog did for him was to socialize him so that he could go back into civilization and live with people. And thank you all very much. Oh.